We did a great study, and when I mean great, it was just fun, of the National Spelling Bee kids. I called up the director of the National Spelling Bee, who herself was a National Spelling Bee champion. She corrected the spelling on my email on her return, and that was fine too. And these kids are these, extraordinarily children, and I think many people have this stereotype that, spelling bee kids are verbal geniuses, and the ones who win the spelling bee are sort of more genius-like than the ones who don't win the spelling bee. So I asked the director if that were true, and she said, I don't think so, but I don't know what it is. So we surveyed kids before they actually went to the bee, and what we found was that, again, grit is the dark blue line. So the kids who actually placed higher in the finals of the National Spelling Bee were higher in grit, and here's their verbal IQ. Verbal IQ did predict, but again, the kids who are really high in verbal IQ tended to be lower in grit. So they were not married, they were inversely related. And self-discipline here, being able to resist temptation, stay on a diet, do your homework when you need to. Interestingly, the kids who are very high in self-discipline did do better. But there was also this slacker group in the bottom 25% of self-discipline who also did quite well, but just about as well as the top. So again, self-discipline, great for doing homework, terrific predictor of GPA, not such a great predictor of, are you going to go found the Blue Man Group and stay with it, et cetera, et cetera. In a follow-up study to this one, we investigated why is it that gritty kids are winning the spelling bee. So we recruited another sample of kids from the following year's spelling bee. We sent them surveys, we measured their grit on self-report questionnaires, but then we asked them very detailed questions about what they did. So it turns out that kids who are in the National Spelling Bee competition, they're studying anywhere from, an hour a week to scarily 35 or 40 hours a week. But what differentiates kids who are gritty from kids who are not gritty is not just the hours of work that they're putting in, they're putting the hardest kind of work in. They're not studying the words that they already know. They're not sitting around being quizzed on what's, already pretty much coming easily. They isolate what they don't know. They identify their own weaknesses, and then they work just on that. And that seems to be characteristic of high achievement and of what grit enables you to do. Is basically be in a very uncomfortable place for some part of your day, working extremely hard, and then to get up and do it all over again and again and again. There's a graph that goes with this 10-year rule that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. This is the deliberate practice graph. This graph actually accurately describes the rise of skill, or the gain in skill over time, for really just about any domain that's been studied. Even Mozart, who some would argue is proof of concept for genius, right? Mozart must have been born as great as he was, because who else could have been composing, melodies that we're still listening to, at the age of 5 or 6? It turns out that Mozart also fits this graph, but he was doing probably 8 hours of deliberate practice a day from as early as he could sit up, whereas most world-class performers only do 4. But Mozart at a very early age had already accumulated basically 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Here's the interesting thing of the graph. So it's really 10 years since you start a discipline till you get to world-class peak performance. And what's another interesting point about this, which you kind of can't see from this graph, is that most people do this, right? They don't have the grit to essentially sustain this deliberate practice over all of this time, and they basically plateau here.